Unless speaking, should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. And to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. With that, I'll go into my opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing titled Cargo Preference Compliance with and Enforcement of Maritime by American Laws. Today, we will hear testimony from 5 witnesses. The first testimony will be from Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, who is appearing before Congress for the first time in her role as the new administrator of the Maritime Administration. Welcome and congratulations on your confirmation, Admiral. I am glad that you have come on board to lead MARID at this important time with all the challenges that are before us. Admiral Phillips will be joined on today's first panel by Mr. Andrew Von Awe, Director of the Physical Infrastructure Team at the Government Accountability Office. 2 days ago, the GAO publicly released his team's report on actions needed to enhance cargo preference oversight. After months of interviews, research, and discussion with federal agencies, maritime labor, and cargo carriers, amongst others, the GAO has found evidence of lack of oversight. Let me repeat that, lack of oversight, inconsistent application, and non-compliance among government agencies and contractors. As a result, GAO has recommended that cargo preference be reported to the public on an annual basis and that the Department of Transportation take steps to fully enforce cargo preference requirements. I'd also like to emphasize the fact that we will be discussing a long-standing public law that has never been adequately enforced, not a new proposal. Today's second panel will feature a military sea lift expert, Mr. Byron Clark, Director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute, and 2 representatives from the commercial maritime industry, Mr. Eric Ebling, speaking on behalf of USA Maritime, and Captain Don Marcus, President of the International Organization of Masters, Mates, and Pilots, representing maritime labor. As I expect, our witnesses will make clear compliance with cargo preference law is closely tied to the sustainment of American jobs and national security. It requires that government-impelled cargo be shipped overseas using U.S.-flagged vessels. In other words, vessels crewed by U.S. mariners, owned by Americans, and abiding by U.S. laws. Guaranteeing a steady supply of cargo through cargo preference programs equates to job security for these hardworking citizens. Along with the Maritime Security Program and the Jones Act, cargo preference ensures that the U.S. seagoing maritime industry does not disappear completely, as it has dwindled over the years. With cargo backlogs and rising inflation as pressing concerns, we know better than ever that maintaining a vibrant U.S. flagged fleet is the foundation of a healthy economy. We cannot rely on foreign ships and foreign mariners to carry out our commerce any longer. Finally, we must not forget the impact of cargo preference on our nation's defense. The law mandates that 100% of the Department of Defense cargo and 50% of non-military government-impelled cargo be shipped on U.S.-flagged vessels when those vessels are available at a fair and reasonable rate. Cleaning up the way, quote, availability, end quote, is decided and communicated will increase the amount of cargo available to U.S. carriers, bolstering the maritime industry while accomplishing DoD's sea lift capacity needs. Today, I expect to hear actionable next steps out of MARID, entrusting ill-suited agencies to make determinations has led to the poor compliance rates we're currently seeing. Enforcement power was provided to MARID in 2009 in DAA, and action is long overdue. We need a completed rulemaking. It is a stated priority of President Biden, and it needs to be a priority of every agency. We have a lot of ground to cover, today with the help of our witnesses. I will thank each of them for their gracious attendance, and I'm excited to begin. With that, I will now call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Gibbs, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also congratulations to Admiral Phillips on your confirmation. The United States uses several federal assistance programs to hedge against its inability to compete in the international ship operating market against vessels which operate under flags of convenience, which use low-paid, third-world crews. These programs include requiring internal domestic shipments be shipped on the U.S. flag, crewed, manned, and built vessels, loan guarantees for ship construction, the Maritime Security Program, which subsidizes the operation of certain military use full cargo vessels, and cargo reservation programs we are looking at today. Implementation of U.S. cargo reservation or cargo preference programs, and especially at the failure to write, much less implement, the cargo preference enforcement regulations Congress mandated in 2009. All Department of Defense generates cargoes, and 50% of the federal agency-generated cargoes must be carried in U.S. flag vessels with U.S. crews. In conjunction with the Maritime Security Program, this provides the U.S. with an internal commercial fleet of 84 vessels. These vessels and the U.S. mariners that crew them provide the crucial capacity to meet future U.S. national defense sea lift needs. Unfortunately, the agencies which generate cargo shipments take a short-sighted view and have tangled MARAD efforts to write cargo preference enforcement regulations in the interagency regulatory review process, in essence, killing these regs before they are even implemented. I look forward to hearing witnesses' testimony today, and especially how they believe the regulatory hurdles that have prevented MARAD from writing and implementing cargo preference enforcement regulations can be overcome. Thank you, Chairman Carbajal, and I look forward to the testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I would now like to welcome our first witnesses for the first panel. Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, Administrator of the Maritime Administration, Mr. Andrew Von Awe, Director of Fiscal Infrastructure at the Government Accountability Office. Thank you both for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witness full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. With that, Rear Admiral Phillips, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and of course, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves. I'm honored to appear today to discuss cargo preference programs. As a retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral with more than 30 years of service, I know the American Merchant Marine is critical to our national defense as well as to our economy. In June, General Jacqueline Van Ovost, Commander, Transportation Command, spoke at the graduation of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, and in addressing our graduates, General Van Ovost made the same critical point, saying that, quote, as a maritime nation, our national security depends on the Merchant Marine. However, she also warned the graduates that they, quote, are about to face challenges our country has not encountered since World War II. Further, she said, and I quote again, contested waters will stress our logistics lines all the way from home port. Cargoes paid for by American taxpayers belong on American ships. Cargo preference requirements are not just Buy America requirements, they are requirements that also help strengthen America. In 2012, there were 106 ships in the foreign flag trade flying the U.S. flag. 4 years later, there were just 77 vessels. Today, from that low point, we have grown back to 87 foreign trading ships under the U.S. flag. However, without cargoes, ships will leave the U.S. flag. Without cargoes, our modest fleet will continue to dwindle. Without cargoes, we risk our ability to move military cargoes on American vessels whenever and wherever needed. I appreciate the thoughtful new report issued by the Government Accountability Office and know this is an important opportunity to further strengthen federal compliance with cargo preference statutes and regulations. Given the critical importance of compliance with cargo preference requirements, MARAD continuously and directly engages with federal acquisition officials and contractors over project life cycles to advise them on the practical application of cargo preference, including how to organize supply chains to maximize the use of U.S. flagged vessels. I am also in the process of writing to all federal departments and agencies, reminding them of their obligations and requesting that they each identify a senior accountable official consistent with OMB's implementing guidance on Executive Order 14005, who can be a single point of contact with whom MARAD can work to implement cargo preference requirements. MARAD also works to ensure that agencies make up for cargoes transported on foreign vessels by employing U.S. flag vessels to carry equal or greater volumes. Facilitating make-up cargoes produces revenue opportunities for the U.S. flagged fleet. It gets cargo on ships. MARAD has been evaluating options to advance our cargo preference rulemaking. We recognize this effort will be a complex undertaking. Success will entail addressing multiple priorities, including the critical importance of supporting our U.S. flagged fleet, while also ensuring that urgent aid is transported with expediency consistent with America's commitment to those in need and our many foreign policy objectives. To lay the foundation for a rulemaking effort that navigates this intersection, MARAD plans to issue a request for information to seek input from all stakeholders. Under the Biden-Harris administration, MARAD is also committed to growing our U.S. flagged fleet. The administration has proposed that Congress eliminate the 3-year period that vessels entering the U.S. flag must currently wait before they are eligible to carry preferenced cargoes. Moreover, in the 2023 presidential budget proposal, the administration requested that Congress fully fund the new tanker security program at $60 million, which would support 10 U.S. flagged vessels. Growing our fleet is also critical to ensuring we have enough mariners with current unlimited tonnage licenses and ratings to meet our sea lift needs in a worst-case scenario. Vessel operators report that mariner availability is still a challenging issue. And on September 23rd, I am convening a summit with industry and labor to discuss recruitment and retention challenges. In closing, I would highlight that these remaining challenging times, COVID has made hard jobs harder and has created new stresses that are clearly affecting mariners' well-being and willingness to continue sailing. I appreciate this committee's commitment to our U.S. flagged fleet and your leadership in support of our cargo preference programs. I'm pleased to answer your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Phillips. With that, we'll move to hear from Mr. Von All. You may proceed.
Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss MARAD's oversight of cargo preference requirements. The federal government ships many types of cargo internationally, such as military supplies, food aid for nations experiencing famine, and government employees' household goods and personal vehicles. Cargo preference laws, regulations, and policies require that when cargo owned or financed by the federal government is shipped internationally, certain percentages of that cargo be carried on U.S. flag vessels. The requirements are designed to ensure the U.S. flag shipping industry has sufficient vessels and trained mariners to supplement the cargo carrying capacity of military ships during times of war and national emergency, among other things. My statement today discusses the key findings and recommendations in our report issued earlier this week. The statement addresses the extent to which MARAD has monitored and reported on federal agencies' compliance with cargo preference requirements and the extent to which MARAD has provided direction to federal agencies on how to meet cargo preference requirements and has enforced those requirements. MARAD relies on bills of lading submitted by contractors or agencies to monitor agencies' cargo volumes. However, MARAD does not determine whether agencies are in compliance with cargo preference requirements for 2 reasons. First, it is not obligated to make compliance determinations under existing laws. Nonetheless, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2009 granted MARAD authorities to take certain cargo preference-related enforcement actions, and MARAD would need to issue regulations and make compliance determinations to implement those authorities. Second, MARAD is unable to validate if it is getting all the bills of lading for cargoes funded or financed by the government to make comprehensive compliance determinations. In some cases, carriers have notified MARAD of government cargoes sent on foreign flag vessels that were not subsequently reported to MARAD, so it is likely that there is some amount of cargo not accounted for in MARAD's data. Nonetheless, the data that MARAD does receive is the best available source of information for government shipping and can be useful to assess whether agencies are making progress towards their cargo preference requirements. Furthermore, MARAD has not publicly reported cargo preference data since 2013. For a number of years, MARAD reported agencies' cargo preference data in publicly available annual reports to Congress, but stopped in part because Congress eliminated the statutory reporting requirement in 2008. With respect to MARAD's direction to federal agencies on how to meet and enforce the requirements, MARAD works collaboratively with agencies and their contractors to make them aware of the requirements, help them to locate U.S. flag vessels, and provide training where needed. In cases where MARAD has identified potential instances of noncompliance, MARAD has referred those cases to the relevant agencies and worked with the agencies and contractors to identify additional cargo to be shipped on U.S. flag vessels to compensate for prior cargo volumes sent on foreign flag vessels. However, MARAD has not clarified how agencies should implement two key procedures that we identified: determining the non-availability of U.S. flag vessels and calculating agencies' percentages of cargo volume shipped on U.S. flag vessels. Without clarification from MARAD on how to implement these procedures, several agencies included in our review developed their own policies for making non-availability determinations and for calculating compliance that MARAD officials may not always agree with. Further, MARAD has not taken any enforcement actions as granted by the 2009 NDAA because it has not issued regulations to carry out those enforcement authorities. The agency began developing regulations in 2009, but terminated the effort in 2017 due to challenges in reaching sought-after consensus with other federal agencies. To address these issues, we made two recommendations, which MARAD has concurred with. First, we recommended that MARAD publicly report cargo preference data, and second, we recommended that MARAD pursue options for overcoming the challenges to developing cargo preference regulations. These actions could include such things as using a negotiated rulemaking as a means to help achieve consensus on how to implement cargo preference requirements, and also to develop a legislative proposal to address other statutory challenges MARAD has identified. Absent these steps, MARAD will continue to lack tools that can help it meet its maritime goals and objectives. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I would be happy to address any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Von Awe. With that, I'm going to move into questions. I'll recognize myself first. In 2020, former Transcom Commander Lyons called for 100% cargo preference on all government-impelled cargoes. Given that cargo preference is subject to the availability of vessels at fair and reasonable rates, and that the Department of Defense cargo already has the requirement, how would an increase to 100% in civilian cargo preference affect the U.S. flag fleet? Rear Admiral Phillips, the U.S. flag fleet is responsible for carrying less than 2% of America's foreign cargo. After witnessing supply chain issues over the past few years, what are the risks associated with that dynamic? How important is cargo preference, which helps maintain a U.S. flag fleet, to addressing that concern?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I can summarize the impacts, I think, in a rather succinct way, which would be that additional cargo, more cargo, will drive more ships into the U.S. flag fleet, and more ships to carry more cargo will work to expand mariners and certainly drive a need for additional mariners into the U.S. flag fleet and provide them good-paying jobs. So in the context of, should Congress decide to make any decisions in that context, which we're not asking for, but certainly more cargo will drive the need for more vessels, which will drive the need for more mariners. In the context of how a strong and vital U.S. flag fleet could influence and might have had an influence, I would say, an additional influence on the challenges we faced during the past several years with COVID and our supply chain challenges, I can say that Buy America and Ship America is a way to think about it. We would have much more control with a larger and more vibrant U.S. flag fleet on our exports, in particular, and also on our imports. In fact, we would have much more control over our supply chain, which is so vital to our economy. So you can make that tie that U.S. flag vessels and our U.S. merchant marine provide vital economic and national security support for this country, and that is the vital nature of why having a merchant marine is so important and why having U.S. flag vessels is so important to this country. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Von Awe, if you could answer the first question, I'll just reiterate the last part of it. How would an increase to 100% in civilian cargo preference affect the U.S. flag fleet?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Chairman Carbajal. So all cargoes, as the Admiral mentioned, help sustain the fleet. I think it's a little bit unclear as to whether or the extent to which it would drive additional vessels into the U.S. flag for a couple of reasons. First, just setting aside food aid cargo, the amount of cargo shipped by civilian agencies is typically a fairly small percentage of the overall government cargoes shipped. We're talking like between 1% and 5% typically. So I'm not sure that, if that were 100%, that would provide enough incentive to bring additional vessels into the U.S. flag fleet, but it would be speculation on my part. If you talk about food aid, we're talking about a much larger amount of cargo that would be available for U.S. flag vessels. However, there are only 3 current dry bulk cargo vessels in the fleet. So here's where the 3-year waiting period becomes a bit of a barrier, right? So carriers, that would provide an incentive for carriers to bring those vessels into the fleet, but they have a 3-year waiting period where that would, they would have to be willing to, hold on to those vessels for 3 years. So for at least those 3 years, you wouldn't see any additional vessels. But at that time, I would just point out that at that point, you'd be bringing dry bulk cargo vessels into the fleet. Those are vessels that DoD has sort of determined to be perhaps the least military useful for their purposes. And you would also be starting to raise costs to ship food aid. So those food aid agencies would certainly have some concerns about the amount of food that they'd be able to ship to those countries in need.
Thank you. Mr. Bonall, after President Biden took office, he signed an executive order 14005, which, among other things, strengthened oversight and enforcement over cargo preference laws in order to maximize the utilization of U.S. flag vessels and encourage shipper agencies to go above the statutory minimum. The executive order further created a Made in America office to help ensure that the policies were being followed. Given the current level of compliance and enforcement, has this executive order been successful? If not, who is to blame?
So our review didn't review the Made in America office specifically, but I would say that during the course of our review, we didn't hear from any agencies the desire to increase their use of U.S. flag vessels, put it that way. Early on in our engagement, we did talk to the Made in America office. Their plan was to partner with MARAD to work with agencies to designate points of contact, as the Admiral mentioned in her opening statement, that the MARAD and the Made in America office could work together to understand sort of where cargo preference stood within the agencies. And so that's as much as we know at this point. I'm sure there's a status update that we could provide to you at a later date.
Thank you. It sounds like the president needs to have his Made in America office do a little bit more work. Thank you very much. With that, I'll recognize Representative Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. Rear Admiral, in 2009, Congress, as you know, enacted legislation led by then Chairman Elijah Cummings to assure that MARAD had the final say which government-impelled cargo shipments were subject to federal cargo preference requirements. Unfortunately, MARAD has difficulties implementing that. And then the GAO released last week, recommends that MARAD look at innovative ways to complete the rulemaking, including possibly a negotiated rulemaking process. What actions does MARAD plan to take to find a way through the regulatory thicket that is this interagency review process? And then also, is it a negotiated rulemaking a possibility, or does it threaten MARAD's decision-making rule as provided in statute?
Ranking Member Gibbs, thank you for that question, sir. As I've stated in my opening statement, MARAD has and is in the process of sending a letter to agencies and departments that outlines our current regulatory processes, requesting agencies' assistance in complying with and fulfilling their responsibilities under those current processes. In addition to that, in the context of rulemaking, we intend to issue very soon a request for information to stakeholders so that we can understand what their particular challenges are with the regulation as it exists, with the law as it exists, so that we can then begin to move forward ultimately into a rulemaking process. So that's our first step, is the letter requesting their compliance and also requesting they designate a senior accountable official under the auspices of, as has also been requested by the Made in America office under Executive Order 14005, a request for information from our stakeholders so that we can gather their information and move forward, and then from there move into a rulemaking process ultimately.
Okay, Director Van Ho, has GAO found other circumstances which negotiated rulemaking help break the loose interagency regulatory logjams on complex issues? Have you had other experience with other agencies?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ranking Member Gibbs. Yes, it has worked in a number of instances with EPA, with OSHA, with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, with FAA. Actually, I think FAA was one of the first to use negotiated rulemaking for some pilot issues that were being worked through. So it is a useful tool. It can, particularly when, in a regular rulemaking process, it can be adversarial when there are some difficult issues to work through. Usually you've got parties taking extreme viewpoints on either side, usually in anticipation of some kind of litigation down the road. So a negotiated rulemaking allows those parties to come around the table with a mediator, work through some difficult issues, and come up with some innovative solutions to avoid those kinds of things down the line.
Yeah, makes sense. Admiral, in the HR 7900, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023, passed by the House, requires the Maritime Administration to find a rule. We're having a statutory deadline for completion of these rules. Assist MARAD in completing the rules. Is that going to be helpful if that passes into law, having that statutory deadline?
Ranking Member Gibbs, can you repeat your question, sir? I can't quite hear you.
Okay, in the NDA bill 2023 that passed the House, it requires a final implement of the section, a final deadline, and a statutory deadline for completion of these rules.
Thank you for that question, sir, regarding a deadline. Deadlines are always helpful, provided they are realistic, sir. So I think the challenge there would be what exactly is the deadline being considered? And in this context, as you are well aware, this is a very complex challenge. Rulemakings have been attempted in the past. They have failed. And so in the context of how we would move forward with the rulemaking, and even in the initial request for information from agencies, that will take some time and review to ensure.
I think the point Congress is just wants to get done, and I think that's part of the deadline.
Yes, sir. Thank you. You understand that.
Director, in our next panel, Dr. Clark is proposing that DoD ship oil from U.S. depots rather than foreign depots, and as was mentioned, there's been a drop in shipments from U.S. flag, mainly oil tankers. Would his proposal, do you think it would claw back much of it back to his recommendation to claw it back to U.S. ships, and if the case, having to ship out of domestic U.S. depots, would there be additional cost that would be significant or not?
Thanks for that question, Ranking Member. If I understand it correctly, I'm not sure I'd be able to comment on whether or not that would be providing, that would be, get more cargo onto U.S. vessels. It's always going to be a question of the availability of vessels at the given time and place that they're looking to ship those cargoes. And so I believe that would help, but it's hard for me to say, not knowing the specifics of the situation.
Well, I guess one of the questions I might have for him is, having to go back to U.S. depots versus more accessible, what that might do to the cost. I don't know. That would be a question, but
sure. Yeah.
I yield back. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I will now move on to the rest of the members, recognizing them for 5 minutes. First, I'll move to Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator Phillips, with regards to the hurdles that GAO outlined in this report to get to regulations, are there any other reasons that MARAD has not developed regulations to begin issuing civil penalties to enforce cargo preference?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Larson. There are, as you're well aware, the cargo preference requirements are quite challenging. They are quite complicated, and within them, pivotal language is not defined. They also, in some instances, predate existing current types of ships. We do a lot of container shipping now. Look at 1954 Act, and there were no container ships at that point in time. So there are things that have changed over time that make this a complicated situation. Within the context of our authority under the law to issue citations or to issue any particular enforcement actions, the agencies are charged with compliance, 50% or more for civilian agencies, but the law specifically applies or describes fines against persons. And so part of the challenge in that context is, okay, which persons? How might we find them? What is the requirement? What is the statutory level of a violation? The law refers to, for example, a willing and knowful violation. That is a very high level of culpability, my counsel tells me. So how might we enforce that? How would we determine it? All of these things are reasons for a regulatory process so that we can determine how we might enforce such regulations in the future. Again, and getting back to the complexity of the regulations as they currently exist. Thank you, sir.
You noted in your testimony, and I think answered a question here about the timing of the RFI, and you said soon. Is there a more specific date than soon?
There is not yet a defined date, sir, and I appreciate your interest in that and understand it. In order to issue an RFI, we will have to review carefully the nature of the questions that we ask so that we don't wander into rulemaking territory yet, and that will require legal review and regulatory review. But we are certainly interested in expediting the process, and I will commit to doing so. Thank you.
Do you feel or believe or have a view on whether or not MARAD has strong enough singular authority over other agencies on cargo preference? It seems that looking back at the failure of establishing the rulemaking in the past, it reads as if the agencies walked away and MARAD didn't have the ability to keep them at the table.
Thank you for that question, sir. MARAD has the authority of the law behind it, and the law has been in place since 1954. It has been reinvigorated in 2009 and in subsequent additional actions, but we do have the power of the law behind us. I can't speak, and there certainly were challenges addressed by previous agencies and under previous circumstances, but at this point in time, we believe the authority of the law is what we have and what we need to be able to move forward in this context to move a regulatory process.
Yeah. The Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act invested $450 million in MARAD this year. Are you using any of those dollars to enforce cargo preference laws and regulations?
Thank you for that question, sir. The bipartisan infrastructure law did indeed provide $450 million to the Maritime Administration under the Port Infrastructure Development Program for port infrastructure development in particular. And so those funds are very specifically targeted at port infrastructure development.
Director Von Ah, thank you. Your testimony states that MARAD monitors federal agencies' cargo volumes to calculate the percentage of U.S. flag shipments, but does not use this data to determine agencies' compliance. As these compliance determinations are necessary for even contemplating civil penalties for lack of compliance, can MARAD use the data more effectively in your view?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Larson. So there's a couple of difficulties in determining compliance, and it stems from some ambiguities in the original law that make it sort of more difficult. And those things are things that GAO has talked about in prior reports and recommended that Congress address. One of them is to deal with sort of ambiguities about what is meant by a geographic area, because compliance is also supposed to be determined by geographic area, and another is by vessel type. It's supposed to be determined by vessel type as well, but as the Admiral mentioned, some of the vessel types don't exist or didn't exist at the time when the law was originally written. So those would need to be clarified first and foremost for MARAD to start to make compliance determinations. The other issue is that there's sort of a difficulty in knowing whether or not MARAD has all of the bills of lading that agencies, for all of the shipments that agencies have made. And so that's a little bit more of a difficult problem, and there's sort of we don't know what we don't know there. There's a certain amount that may not be being reported to MARAD, and there's ways that MARAD is considering looking at certain kinds of customs data and other databases to investigate whether there are shipments out there that are not being reported to them. But that's another one of the challenges in terms of determining whether the agency is in compliance or not.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. And next, I will recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're Admiral Phillips, a couple of questions for you. I'm from the Gulf Coast of Texas, starting at Louisiana, border of that other foreign country. And I've got the Port of Beaumont and Sabine Neches waterway in my district. And so, there's Marriott has some facilities out there. Are you familiar with those facilities?
Yes, sir, I am familiar with them in that we do have a regional office in that area. I have not yet had the opportunity to visit, and I hope to do so very soon.
Well, we do want you to come out there and spend lots of money in my district, just so you know. Beaumont, are you aware that Beaumont moves more military personnel and equipment than any other port in the United States?
I'm aware that it is an extremely busy port in the context of moving military requirements. Yes, sir, thank you.
Okay, we want to make sure that that's on our radar. In your opinion, Admiral, what's the best thing that Marriott administration could do? We're talking about getting more flagged vessels with the supply chains already stretched to the max. What's the best thing the Marriott administration could do to facilitate that? Money is no object.
Thank you, sir. If only that were true. I appreciate your interest in that question, and I think some things that we are already doing that are already underway, pending certainly in legislation for the Biden administration, would be eliminating the 3-year wait, which we've described earlier in testimony today. That will give more options for more vessels to join the U.S. flag fleet, particularly in cases where we have only a few of a certain type, bulk carriers being one of them. Which would then provide additional options for agencies who are shipping food aid in particular, and perhaps give them more opportunities to more easily comply with the requirement. Certainly that's a way to expand the U.S. flag fleet. And then in addition, under the tanker security program, we have an appropriation for that. We've requested that again in 2023. That will bring that will bring 10 tank vessels, petroleum product carriers into the U.S. flag fleet as well. So those are 2 ways near term that we can and hope to expect that we will see growth.
Well, let me break in if I may. You mentioned earlier, I think, in getting the rulemaking actually going off of dead center, for lack of a better term, you had counsel looking at it. Do I remember that correctly? Or you would have legal counsel looking at it? You didn't want to get in the rulemaking process?
Well,
What was your comments? I came in kind
right,
of
certainly,
late.
I think the discussion actually, sir, was in the context of how soon an RFI could be issued. We would certainly want counsel to review that.
Gotcha.
And then the next step would be a rulemaking process.
How many people would you say in that office is working on that?
Sir, are you asking how many people are in the Office of Cargo and Commercial Sea Lift?
Yes, ma'am, that would help move this process along.
Well, I would say that the administration more broadly is going to be involved in moving this process along. So I probably have between 20 and 25 in the Office of Commercial Sea Lift.
But how many in your office is interacting with the administration? That's really the heart of my question about that process.
Well, I would.
You have 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, 7 people?
I have a full legal staff. My counsel is here with me today. She and her staff would be supporting this. The Office of Cargo and Commercial Sea Lift is here. The administrator of that is here as well. So we're talking, I don't know, 20, 30 people at times involved in this.
Okay, I'm just trying to get a handle on, what kind of attention, what kind of manpower is available to actually follow this through. And you talked about we talked about the lack of rules hurting the entry of more American flag vehicles. So it's important to us, especially important to our ports. I also have 7 ports in my district, more than any other member of Congress. Some have 4, we have 7. The Sabine Neches waterway is the 2nd longest waterway in the Gulf of Mexico, second only to the Mississippi River. So a lot, and by the way, the Port of Houston is not one of my 7 ports. It comes through Galveston Bay up into the Houston Ship Channel. We have a lot of traffic that moves in and out. So we're wanting to make sure that we can get as much of this done as quickly as we can to facilitate, America staying on top and getting back on top of the supply chain crisis and being ready should a military excursion be necessary. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. The gavel was passed. I'll do my best to follow on here from the chairman who had to go to another classified meeting. Our next questioner is Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're doing already an excellent job there. My question first is to Mr. Bonal. Your report and your testimony clearly show a disturbing trend. And I was particularly surprised to see your finding on page 19 of your report that USAID seeks a blanket waiver for dry bulk cargo vessels because it believes these vessels do not have military use. I think this really, and I know this really fails to understand the value of a US flagged fleet. Vladimir Putin has made Ukrainian grain exports into a weapon to coerce the world during his war on aggression. The lesson is clear. Losing control over a critical global supply chain can be dangerous. A US flag fleet gives us options in the event of contingencies like a future global commodity crisis. So I want to switch now to Admiral Phillips. I'm very concerned that USAID's mistaken rationale reflects the absence of clear guidance, let alone regulations from MARAD on the importance of these federal laws. I want to join my colleagues in urging you to consider implementing the GAO recommendation to consider a negotiated rulemaking. We've already discussed that. I just want to join in supporting the negotiated rulemaking. I want to ask you, Admiral Phillips, do you believe that the existing laws are strong enough to enable you to overcome resistance from agencies like I just mentioned, USAID, to uphold congressional intent?
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal, for that question. I believe that existing law is strong enough to allow us to execute a rulemaking and move through this process, working with our sister and our fellow agencies as described. With the force of the law behind us, we have the authority to do this and to work with our fellow agencies to move forward, and also to ensure that they understand the force of the law that is behind this. That said, I'm a realist. I understand this is a challenging process and it has been tried before and has failed. However, I believe that with the interest in global shipping and US flag shipping that we have certainly seen in the last 2 years under the COVID crisis and the supply chain challenges we have had, that we are in a different position now and we may have more attention to this need than we might have had in the past. So yes, sir, I think we have sufficient authority under the law, and we will put that to the test as we move forward with this process. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I'm going to yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. We now turn to Mr. Van Drew. For 5 minutes, Mr. Van Drew, are you somewhere around? Mr. Van Drew, you're about to lose your place. Mr. Auchincloss, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. This question is about MARAD's mandate to support the military and how the Marines' force readiness plans will streamline MARAD's support capability, and it's for you, Rear Admiral. Cargo preference, coupled with other programs such as the Maritime Security Program and Voluntary Intermodal Sea Lift Agreement, are intended to support the U.S. flag shipping industry so that the United States is a fleet capable of supplementing the capacity of the U.S. military with U.S. flagged vessels and trained mariners during times of war and national emergency, while also providing transportation for the nation's maritime commerce. The Commandant of the Marine Corps' 2030 force design includes significant ground force reductions, and the Marines' plan includes pursuing new capabilities to increase littoral maritime mobility and resilience. With this recalibration, it would follow that this would lessen MARAD's requirement that it has the ship capability to support a national security emergency. What impact do you foresee the Commandant's Force Redesign 2030 plan having on MARAD's operating costs?
Mr. Auchincloss, thank you for that question. We, as you are aware, work very directly with the Transportation Command, U.S. Transportation Command, who is responsible for overseeing transportation, military transportation broadly. In that context, and in support of your specific question with the Marine Corps' changes and challenges, which I'm aware of, we would work with Transcom to understand what the needs are and what they will be in the future. I would add that the Transportation Command is very interested in additional merchant capacity for other reasons, including support of product tankers in the Pacific in particular, and other additional requirements. So I would revert back to Transcom to work with their fellow services to ensure that they support the needs of the Marine Corps and to understand what those impacts might be more broadly, which then we respond to and provide the services that they request from us in that context.
Can you continue on that thread, Rear Admiral? Because I think it's worth pushing on the fact that, if I'm correct, our merchant marine volume has actually, or number of ships has actually declined since World War II, and yet as we're pivoting from a transatlantic requirement like we had in World War II, really to support our European allies, towards an Indo-Pacific one where the distances are much greater and the need for maritime transportation potentially much greater, do you feel like we are in a position where we could support with the merchant marine an Indo-Pacific strategy?
So thank you for that question, sir. That is actually the point of working with Transportation Command to understand the need, and in particular, their identification of a shortfall in the, well, I just lost my microphone, in the ability to handle the needs in the context of product tankers and tank vessels to support scenarios that would be of interest in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific theater.
Thank you for that. And can you talk as well about, and this might be more for you, Mr. Vano, about how coordinated sanction implementation on Russia, either global price cap and the maritime insurance regulations that we're putting into place in conjunction with the European Union at the end of 2022 might affect the maritime industry?
I'm not sure our work spoke to that, Representative Auchincloss. I'm not sure if the Rear Admiral has any points of view on that.
Thank you, sir. I don't in particular. I will say that we certainly have been asked and have supported with Ready Reserve Force vessels and provided assistance in the Ukraine context as directed by Transcom. And
has cargo preference impacted our ability to send aid abroad to countries like Ukraine?
That's an interesting question. Our work in the context of supporting Ukraine is directed through the Transportation Command to be able to move military cargo to this point, which is 100% compliance.
Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Van Drew, how nice of you to join us. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning. And I appreciate you holding today's hearings on the enforcement of maritime by American laws. The supply chain crisis has shown that we need to invest in American port infrastructure to strengthen our economic position. This includes cargo handling infrastructure like cranes, which are not currently made in the United States of America. Unfortunately, a neglected manufacturing base and burdensome regulations have put our country in a difficult position when it comes to improving our port infrastructure. These factors have led to a situation where the cost of ocean shipping actually sometimes exceeds the value of the cargo that we're shipping out. This arrangement is economically unsustainable for the United States of America. Administrator Phillips, could you explain how current regulations are impeding ports' ability to use DOT grant funds to decrease cargo backlogs, prepared for increased trade, and stay competitive? further, what actions can we take to align the economics of maritime shipping with the value of American exports?
Congressman, thank you for that question, sir. In the context of port infrastructure and support for port infrastructure, as you are aware, the Maritime Administration supports the Port Infrastructure Development Program, which as discussed earlier in testimony, has received $450 million under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law this year, bringing our total, including appropriations in FY 2022, to about $680 million. That grant program, which will assist ports in improving their infrastructure and improving the capacity and resilience and their ability to move cargo, is under review now and is moving forward, and we expect to announce awards later this fall. So that will help ports nationwide improve their capacity to move cargo. In the context of shipping and commercial shipping and pricing and our ability to regulate that, we do not have ability to regulate that. I would defer those questions, I believe, sir, to the Federal Maritime Commission in the context of the commercial world more broadly. Certainly, U.S. flag shipping would more capacity to ship on U.S. flag vessels would allow us more control, in particular of our exports, as I stated earlier, which we have been challenged to deal with under COVID and the many challenges to our supply chain infrastructure, which of course we're also well aware of, and sir, which you are describing in your question, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up, I have a couple minutes. So do you think we're well on our way to getting this under control, or do you feel that we're still pretty much in the thick of it and have some pretty serious problems here? I mean, this is something that's obviously important for the economy, important for the future, just important in every aspect. So what are we not doing that you'd like to see us do? What are we doing that you like? And how can we do better?
Well, thank you for that question, sir. I will defer on the costs of foreign flag vessel shipping, which certainly has been a challenge across the COVID pandemic and the supply chain challenges. I would say in the context of improving our port infrastructure under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and PIDP in particular, but other grants as well administered by the Department of Transportation, we have a generational opportunity to make change, to build resilience into our ports and our supply chains, and to improve our capacity to move cargo and keep cargo moving. Of course, from our perspective, it's all about getting cargo on ships and on U.S. flag vessels, but in the broader context, certainly under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the grants that have been approved and are underway in the Department of Transportation, and particularly in MARAD, PIDP, will be of significant value to improving our port infrastructure over the next 5 years. Thank you, sir.
So you see that, and through that bipartisan infrastructure bill, you see that as a positive, obviously, and your sense is that we are going in the right direction and that this should be helpful and we should see noticeable improvement in the future.
Yes, sir. In the context of being able to improve our port infrastructure, something that we have long needed and not done, this is a generational change and a generational opportunity, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and commitment, and Chairman, thank you for yours.
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew. I now turn to myself. I believe, Admiral Phillips, you are the 4th administrator in the last decade. I believe that to be accurate. And over that period of time, every administrator's failed to be able to fully implement the cargo preference laws. Given your testimony today, your determination to achieve what others have not been able to do is meritorious, hopeful, but I don't think you're going to be able to do it. As good as you are, as much experience as you have, I'm familiar with the previous folks that held your office. The problem is the law itself. While you do have authority, I'm not sure you have the ability to actually, under the law, force the other American shippers to meet the requirements of the law. A lot of discussion about Transcom here. I'm going to write a letter to Transcom, who is responsible to my subcommittee, the Readiness Subcommittee, and ask her for specific information about just how well she is doing in carrying out the law. Bottom line here is we need to change the law. And I'd like to have your specific thoughts about several of the specific things that we really must do if we're going to maintain our maritime industry. So here we go. You have the power, or you have the authority, responsibility to write regulations. Why have your predecessors been unable to do that? Can they force the negotiations? Do you have the power to actually force negotiations? That is, say it's my way or the highway.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question, and thank you for your interest in cargo preference and enforcing the law. As I've said before, we have the power of the law behind us, and the law has been in place for a number of years. Certainly, the complexities in the law and pivotal language, which is not clearly defined, as we've deferred to earlier in this hearing, the kinds of ships that we use today that weren't in existence when the 1954 law was put in place, all add to the challenge. In addition to that, agencies interpret the law differently. They argue with us and they argue amongst themselves. But setting all that aside, we have an opportunity here, I think, particularly in the context of the understanding and incredible need for our supply chain.
Excuse me, I understand
make a
all of that.
difference.
The committee's heard that already, so I'm going to interrupt you and ask you, if you had the power in a new law to be the arbitrator of the cargo preference that the agencies, USDA, DOD, USAID, had to get your authority to ship on other than American ships, could you carry that out? In other words, you had the power.
So, Mr. Chairman, are you asking me if I have the power now to determine a non-availability?
No, we're going to write, we must write a new law. This simply has not worked. We're well into 2 decades of failure. And so if you, MARAD, had the authority, period, and DOD had to get your permission to ship on other than American ships, USAID and Department of Agriculture, could you carry that out?
So, hypothetically speaking, sir, in the context of what Congress may or may not decide to do, we believe that we have, in the context of civilian authority now, the ability to make a determination as to whether or not ships are available, which in that case would allow agencies to ship U.S. flag if they are available or not if they are not. Anything that strengthens that authority certainly is helpful. However, I defer to Congress in actions they might choose to take in that context, sir.
Of course. Should we increase the cargo preference back to 75%? Would that expand the merchant marine?
Again, I defer to Congress on their decisions in this context, sir. However, back to my original statement, more cargoes will tend to drive more ships, which will also drive a need for more mariners.
Very good. My time has expired. I will simply share with the committee here that I intend to introduce legislation. Look forward to working with the committee and with you and the other American shippers to make it clear that the cargo preference laws are the laws and that there's the ambiguity, confusion, and total disregard for the law by many is terminated. We're going to work on that. I do not believe we have a second round of questions. Pardon? Who is it? Ah, Mr. Maloney. Sean Patrick, you're out there somewhere. Did you just quit on us again? Mr. Maloney? Hello, Mr. Maloney. If you would like to participate, this is your moment. And it's rapidly disappearing. Last call, Mr. Maloney. I believe we have completed the review. Admiral Phillips, I look forward to working with you. Thank you for being here today, and congratulations on your appointment. You may be able to overcome the current inability of the past administrators. But I think if you had the power clearly defined, I'd have confidence you can carry it out. Mr. Van Ah, thank you very much for your continued investigations and clarity of reports. Thank you. We appreciate your attendance here. We now move on to the second panel. The committee will come back to order. Our second panel is now in place. The chairman may be able to return, in which case I will move on. So I'd like to welcome the next panel of witnesses. Mr. Brian Clark, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technologies at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Clark. Mr. Eric Ebeling, President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Roll-Off Carrier on behalf of the USA Maritime. And Captain Don Marcos, President of the International Organization of Masters, Mates, and Pilots. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Captain Marcos, would you like to lead us? After all,
Thank you,
are the
Mr.
captain,
Chairman.
mates, and master.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, good morning. I'm Don Marcus, President of the International Organization of Masters, Mates, and Pilots, AFL-CIO. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to represent America's Seagoing Labor and Transportation Trades Department and Maritime Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. Collectively, our unions represent the vast majority of American professional mariners employed aboard U.S. flag vessels that carry cargo preference cargoes in foreign trade, civilian and defense cargoes. The strict enforcement and enhancement of the U.S. flag cargo preference shipping requirements are essential to provide the base of cargo necessary to sustain U.S. flag vessels in foreign commerce. Without cargo, there are no merchant ships. Without U.S. flag ships, our military and economic independence cannot be guaranteed. Men and women operate these vessels. They do so at all times and in all conditions, in peace and war, during the present pandemic and through all the daily hazards and personal hardships inherent in their occupation. They support their families through employment in good family wage jobs, union jobs. An attack on cargo preference, however, is more than simply another attack on middle-class livelihoods. The consistent support of U.S. flag shipping from you, Mr. Chairman, and many of your colleagues is especially important today. The war in Europe could escalate into direct military involvement at any time by the United States. It is with unwelcome irony that a few months ago in this building, World War II merchant marine veterans finally received a Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their wartime service, and yet, at the same time, there are those in and out of government who are trying to weaken, if not destroy, cargo preference with no regard for its impact on our fourth arm of defense or our maritime workforce. What the opponents of cargo preference refuse to comprehend is that the mariners who operate U.S. flag vessels that carry cargo preference cargoes are the same mariners who operate surge and sustainment vessels that are necessary for our military. With a European conflict raging and an aggressive China supporting a national flag merchant fleet of over 4,000 ocean-going vessels, now is not the time to withdraw government cargo and undermine the commercial viability of the 80 to 85 U.S. flag vessels that are currently operating in foreign trade. To this end, Congress must reject the concurrent resolutions introduced in the House and Senate that attempt to leverage the war in Ukraine to justify a waiver of cargo preference. If these resolutions are enacted, our fleet will be diminished and our sea lift readiness grievously compromised. Secondly, Congress should reverse the arbitrary reduction in cargo preference for food aid that was enacted in 2012. Beginning in 1985 and through 2012, at least 75% of the gross tonnage of international food aid cargoes was to be carried aboard U.S. flag vessels when available at fair and reasonable rates. In addition, the law stipulated that the Department of Transportation would reimburse the food aid programs for any cost premium associated with the use of U.S. flag vessels for more than 50% of the food aid cargoes. This 75% minimum and the reimbursement mechanism should be reinstated. Finally, we ask that Congress provide the Maritime Administration with whatever additional authority it needs to fully administer and enforce the cargo preference statutes as set forth in Section 3511 of the Duncan Hunter National Defense Authorization Act of 2009, PL 110-417. The full exercise of this authority by the Maritime Administration will help to minimize, if not eliminate, interagency disputes over the applicability and implementation of cargo preference. American merchant mariners have served with distinction and courage in every international conflict since our country declared independence. It has never hesitated to sail in war zones anywhere that U.S. troops are deployed. Too often, merchant mariners have sacrificed their lives in this process. Today's American seafarers should not be sold down the river while their predecessors are given congressional gold medals some 75 years after the fact. Full compliance with cargo preference laws is an investment in the U.S. government that it must make to strengthen our commercial sea lift readiness, to support our national security, and protect our national economy. Thank you again for the opportunity to express the views of America's seafaring and transportation labor organizations. We stand ready to provide additional information and work with you and your colleagues to strengthen and grow the U.S. flag merchant marine.
Thank you, Captain Marcos. We stand ready to stand with you. Mr. Ebeling, if you'll present your testimony.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Eric Ebeling, and I am testifying today on behalf of USA Maritime, which is committed to ensuring the U.S. Merchant Marine will always be available to support our warfighters, enhance our economy through trade, and provide great jobs to thousands of Americans across the country. As President and CEO of American Roll-On Roll-Off Carrier, it is my honor to lead the largest U.S. flag railroad operator, a longtime participant in the Maritime Security Program, committed to investing in the U.S. flag fleet and U.S. Merchant Marine. While we've only had a short time to digest the GAO's report, actions needed to enhance cargo preference oversight, the recommendations made by GAO that MARAD should publicly report on cargo preference data and that MARAD should take steps to develop regulations to oversee and enforce compliance with cargo preference requirements are excellent. The U.S. flag commercial fleet and international trade is vitally important to U.S. economic and national security, but that U.S. flag fleet is at a crossroads, with declining cargoes resulting in a shrinking fleet and a shortage of qualified mariners. According to data received by MARAD and provided to GAO, U.S. flag volumes decreased 36% from 2012 to 2020. This impacts national defense readiness, but also impacts the nation's ability to pursue generous overseas economic and agricultural assistance programs. As detailed in my written statement, cargo preference is the key incentive for U.S. flag operators in international trade to remain under U.S. registry and provide a vital cargo base to help offset the cost advantages of operating a foreign flagship, such as regulatory, tax, and crewing costs. The most enduring and effective legislation supporting the U.S. flag fleet has often come in the wake of the nation's wars. The lack of any significant new maritime legislation after Afghanistan and Iraq is telling. Not coincidentally, the U.S. flag fleet has fallen from a recent high of 107 ships in international trade in 2011 to a recent low of 77 ships in 2016 due to major decreases in preference cargoes before restabilizing, primarily due to the reauthorization and stabilization of MSP. According to the GAO report, DoD compliance varied from 82% in 2012, declining to 62% in 2015, before increasing again to 85% in 2020. The GAO report also stated government-owned reserve cargo vessels are held in reduced operating status with minimal crew in peacetime. When put in full operating status, the government can add additional trained and qualified mariners to operate them. That is only so because of the continued existence of a commercial fleet that provides the mariners that crew those reserve ships. As the commander of U.S. Transcom, General Jacqueline Van Ovos, noted in a December 2021 speech, quote, "As a seafaring nation, our country has been and is and will continue to be reliant on the strength of the maritime industry and the many mariners," also pointing to the importance of the U.S. flag fleet and merchant marine as, quote, "America's economic lifeline during peacetime." Civilian agency cargoes include such diverse cargoes as USDA and USAID support and food aid, Federal Transit Administration projects, Department of State cargoes, Department of Energy projects, and many other non-military cargoes shipped or sponsored by the various departments and agencies of the U.S. government. According to the GAO report, USAID compliance was 79% in 2012, but fell to 41% by 2019, while USDA compliance fell from 86% in 2012 to 47% in 2020. One might reasonably ask why such gamesmanship and noncompliance is allowed to persist. The reason has to do with a combination of lax enforcement mechanisms and unclear or non-existent consequences for violators, be they commercial entities or government agencies. As has been touched on, the shortcoming was intended to be addressed by the FY09 NDAA, and if there were any doubt of the intent of that language, it was clarified by one of the sponsors of that language, Senator Daniel K. Inouye, in a 2009 letter to President Barack Obama. In relevant excerpt, quote, "One of the most important elements in sustaining our U.S. flag fleet is its continued ability to carry government-impelled cargo. This provision is intended to provide much-needed clarity that the Department of Transportation is the lead federal agency for the administration, interpretation, and execution of our cargo preference requirements and guidelines. It does not change the application of existing law, but will resolve many of the jurisdictional overlaps that exist with current shipper agencies and ultimately help fashion a more coherent policy regarding the application of cargo preference laws." Close quote. Whether by legislation or executive order, 100% of all government-owned or financed cargoes should be required to move on U.S. flagships. This will help eliminate any gamesmanship. Without cargo, carriers will not invest in ships, and without those ships, there will not be jobs for our merchant mariners, who also crew those government reserve ships in time of need. Congress should ensure that the DOT and MARAD are directed and fully resourced to fully enforce the cargo preference laws and Congress and the administration should consider policies that encourage shippers of all kinds to prioritize U.S. flag shipping as part of their global supply chains, to include government contracting policies and an incentive such as a tax credit for shippers to utilize U.S. flag carriers. GAO was spot on in its two conclusions on cargo preference. USA Maritime stands ready to work with the Congress and the agency on achieving these objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ebeling. We'll now turn to Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, for the opportunity to testify here today about the importance of cargo preference. I'm a retired Navy officer and a think tanker today, so I'm going to talk a little bit more strategically about the challenge posed by noncompliance with cargo preference. Today, China dominates the global shipping industry. They have 6,000 vessels are owned by Chinese companies. More than 4,500 are under Chinese flag. We've heard discussion today about the fact that of the U.S. fleet only has about 85 vessels under U.S. flag that are ocean-going international shipping vessels. There's a disparity that would ordinarily not be that big an issue in a globalized economy operating under the rule of law. But today we're seeing evidence where countries like Russia, like China, are weaponizing their supply chains against their opponents. We could find ourselves in the United States in the position of being the victim of supply chain warfare being imposed on us by a country like China with this enormous reach in the global shipping industry. To avoid America suffering the fate that we see our European allies suffering today under the threat of Russia cutting off gas supplies, we need to improve and expand our own U.S. shipping fleet to provide a hedge against the potential for supply chain warfare and this weaponization of shipping against us. But there's a challenge in doing that, and that gets to cargo preference. Operating under U.S. flag is more expensive than operating under foreign flags of convenience. There's stricter safety rules. Labor requirements require us to have more people to ensure for the safety of the vessel and also its security in foreign ports. And we require that our mariners be U.S. citizens or residents. Carriers that are facing these higher costs cover those costs by carrying preference cargo that is at a premium compared to the price they might receive in the open market, and by getting stipends from the Maritime Security Program and Tanker Security Program. These programs operate in conjunction, though. The stipends from the Maritime Security Program and TSP, the Tanker Security Program, aren't sufficient to cover the higher cost, so preference cargo is absolutely essential. To be able to expand the fleet to support U.S. shipping needs and hedge against supply chain warfare, we're going to need to both expand the use of those stipends, but also ensure that preference cargo is actually provided to the shippers that are charged with carrying it and that are operating under U.S. flag and incurring these higher costs for doing so. That larger fleet is also extremely important to supporting our maritime sea lift demands that the military has during wartime or crisis. The most severe shortfall we're facing right now in our maritime sea lift capacity for wartime demands is in tankers. Today, as Admiral Phillips mentioned, the Tanker Security Program is aiming to provide stipends and hopefully preference cargo for up to 10 tankers that could be U.S. flagged and operating international trade. The requirement that has come out of the most recent Mobility Capabilities Requirement Study from Transcom is for 84 tankers. So we have an enormous shortfall in the number of tankers available under U.S. flag to support U.S. military needs in a crisis or conflict. You could see a situation in which that same set of tankers could also be employed to help provide for U.S. shipping needs for fuel in the event of China employing supply chain warfare against us and using their shipping industry dominance against the United States. There's opportunities to improve that, though. Obviously, we need to improve compliance with cargo preference, and MARAD needs to be charged with being able to do that. We could also, as I mentioned in my written testimony, require that U.S. DoD fuel being provided overseas be sourced from U.S. refineries, which would increase the number of tankers required to carry that fuel, increasing the cargo available, and potentially allowing for an expansion of the Tanker Security Program and providing for more tankers under U.S. flag. But we're going to have to make these changes if we want to be able to have our sea lift capacity that we need for wartime mobilization, as well as be able to insulate ourselves from the potential for the weaponization of supply chains and shipping against the United States, against a China that is going to be increasingly belligerent and willing to use a lot of tools available to it in a hybrid approach to deter U.S. intervention on behalf of Taiwan or other U.S. allies overseas. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I hope that we can have a discussion about these improvements going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark. Now I will proceed with allowing all the members to ask your questions for 5 minutes. I will start by recognizing myself. This is to the entire panel. In the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been legislative efforts to waive cargo preference. What effect would that proposal have on the Mariner base, the number of U.S. flagged vessels, military research capability, and readiness? Don't all jump in at one time.
I'll answer that, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity. I would say it would certainly diminish the amount of vessels available and crew members available to support any kind of sustained military sea lift. If you cut the program you said you'd cut the program, is that correct? Or did you say you'd bring it to 100%?
Cut or 100%?
Okay, well, obviously, if you cut it, and I'm sorry, if you cut it, the amount of sea lift would go down, the amount of available mariners would go down. You're cutting a program from 75% to 50% in 2012. We saw the number of ships available decrease, at least 10 or 15 ships. We saw members permanently leave the industry. So you would have a crew shortage and you would have a shortage of tonnage. And on the other side, if you increase the program from the current 50% to 100%, you would increase your sea lift capability, you would increase your manpower and opportunities to grow the U.S. Merchant Marine.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. Just to maybe expand on that a little bit, any reduction in cargo will have a detrimental impact on the U.S. flag fleet. As Captain Marcus alluded to, that impacts not just the ships, but the mariner pool, and that mariner pool is also crews the government reserve ships. This kind of circumstance is precisely why we have a U.S. flag fleet, so that we can pursue any national security or economic policy that we so choose. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to add to what my colleagues have said, the ships right now cannot operate cost effectively under just the Maritime Security Program stipend. They need the cargo preference cargo to augment that income and be able to operate in the black. So you're going to see a continued erosion of the size of the U.S. fleet without preference cargo, and waiving this requirement would be devastating to that cargo amount.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, the GAO report issued on Monday provides important information on the decline of the size of the fleet of U.S. flagged vessels engaged in international trade. In 1990, there were 199 U.S. flagged vessels in the fleet. But as of 2021, the fleet was down to 84 vessels. What can be done to stabilize the U.S. flagged vessel fleet, in addition to obviously not cutting it, the preference?
Right, obviously not cutting cargo preference. So making sure that preference cargo is carried by U.S. flag ships is really important. So compliance with cargo preference rules is essential. Going after the agencies that have been avoiding using U.S. flag ships for preference cargo will be important. There's agencies that are obviously avoiding that for the purpose of saving money. Also, defense contractors, including defense vendors, are sometimes not using U.S. flag ships to move their cargo, and it's partially a result of not understanding their supply chain, but it's also a result of inadequate oversight. So making sure that preference cargo is shipped on U.S. ships is one. The other part would be looking at expanding the Maritime Security Program. But to expand the Maritime Security Program and its associated stipend, we're going to need to have more preference cargo to make those ships viable economically. So it goes back to cargo preference.
Thank you. Mr. Ebeling, you mentioned foreign military sales as a way to invigorate the market. Can you provide more detail on what the federal government can do there to stabilize the cargo markets for U.S. flag carriers?
Sure. So foreign military sales, there are different types of that, some of which, such as foreign military financing or FMF, are subject to U.S. flag shipping requirements. Other types of FMS may not be. One way to potentially support the U.S. flag fleet is to require all types of FMS or a larger percentage of such to move on U.S. flag ships.
Thank you very much. Captain Marcus, in your testimony, you brought up the administration's emphasis and prioritization of implementing cargo preference requirements And yet there are agencies such as the USDA, USAID, and DOD who are not following the president's executive order. What would this mean to the maritime industry should these agencies comply for a change?
Well, I think it would certainly mean there would be more cargo carried aboard U.S. flag vessels, and there would most likely certainly be more vessels entering service under the U.S. flag, more bulk carriers to carry these commodities. Thank you.
Thank you. I now will go to Representative Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Clark, we're talking about the, on your proposal, because of the 82% drop in U.S. flag vehicles. I got the law here, and I just want to, for clarification, it says supplies bought for the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Marine Corps, or Space Force, or for a defense agency or otherwise transported by the Department of Defense may only be transported by sea in a vessel belonging to the United States or a vessel of the United States, and it has another definition. But then it goes on, there's a waiver provision. The Secretary of Defense may waive the requirement. I assume that's what's happened?
Yes, so what'll happen, internal to the Department of Defense, they make a determination that there's not an available U.S. ship at an acceptable cost or a reasonable cost and schedule, and then they'll choose a foreign flag ship to make the shipment. And that happens a lot because in a perverse sort of cycle, because we've reduced the amount of cargo that we're sending to U.S. ships, the size of the U.S. fleet shrinks, and then it makes it harder to schedule, and so then the agencies can say, well, I can't get a ship with an acceptable schedule or cost, but that's because they've been not using the ships, and therefore the fleet's been shrinking. So
And
yes, they weigh that internally.
I believe that provision is not in our jurisdiction. I think it's probably Armed Services Committee jurisdiction. But
Well, it's that's an internal discussion inside the DoD, but the
I understand
rule set,
that.
right? But MARAD can enforce those rules under the existing law. So it's just the DoD has chosen to establish its own waiver provisions, but under the existing law, MARAD is supposed to be administering the cargo preference rules.
Okay, that's interesting. If they did, in your proposal to ship oil from U.S. depots rather than foreign depots, how much do you think that we'd be able to claw back of that 82%?
It's hard to tell when you look at the math, but it looks like you would be able to at least get 3 more, and probably more than that, tankers under U.S. flag to source that, because it's obviously not going to be completely efficient. So if all that fuel was put on the smallest number of tankers possible, you're looking at 3, maybe 10.
Yeah, I did. I thought that the efficiency is probably lost.
Right. But the cost would be minimal, and it would expand the amount of obviously fuel being shipped on U.S. ships substantially.
Okay. I guess to the other 2 panelists, President Biden's executive order 14,005 strengthens the oversight enforcement, but MARAD has been unable to promulgate the rules. Both your agents, not agencies, but who you represent, are you working with the Biden administration to assure that MARAD is getting cooperation in the interagency review process and able to promulgate these long-delayed regulations? What's your involvement with the Biden administration?
Yes, USA Maritime has had productive discussions with the administration. Hasn't moved the needle much in terms of tangible action yet. Those discussions are ongoing, and we'd be happy to work with the administration and the Congress on further tangible action.
Mr. Marcus?
Yes, I'll follow up in the same way. The AFL-CIO, Transportation Trades Department, the Maritime Trades Department, the labor unions, we have been working for a number of years to try to get the regulatory mechanisms in place that are necessary to actually make this happen. And as has been said earlier in this testimony, it's gone year after year, administrator after administrator, and there needs to be some change, hopefully in the law, to make this more likely. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Marcus, I have a question. It's a little off topic, but I think it's timely. We're looking at a possible railroad strike this Friday, freight rail. And since you represent the AFL-CIO, can you tell us any involvement you've had with the railroad industry to try to mitigate, prevent a strike happening? Because the impact on your members is going to be significant if it happens, I believe.
Well, it's significant for the supply chain, and we've been working closely with the Transportation Trades Department, supporting the railroad workers who have been under the thumb and experienced some horrifying job losses and working conditions and safety problems for decades. So we're supporting the railroad workers and hopefully a just and fair resolution to their labor issues and the supply chain issues that plague the railways can be found.
Are you hopeful?
I would have to say that I think it's going to have to get pushed further to get some real action, but I am optimistic at the end of the day that a resolution will be found.
Because I hope, they find a resolution, because we just went through a major bottleneck at the ports, especially in the West Coast. We saw that. We're slowly digging our way out of that. And I've always said, when one leg of the intermodal system breaks down, it has a tremendous catastrophic effect on the rest. And this could be, after just coming out of COVID and the supply chain issues, to have this happen at this time would be very, puts a very tight, precarious position. I'm worried about that. So I hope everybody's trying to work together to resolve the issue.
Yes, sir, I believe they are. Thank you for the inquiry.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I will now recognize Representative Lowenthal, the distinguished gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you back in the committee. This has been a very interesting discussion, and I want to elaborate on points that have already been made, but we're caught in this vicious cycle. On one hand, agencies are arguing that existing U.S. flag fleet cannot adequately meet their demands. This is used to justify lax enforcement of mandates, which weakens the demand for critical services that are provided by U.S. flag carriers. And it hinders the expansion of the fleet. And I believe the only response to this is to make sure that the fleet is big enough and flexible enough to meet congressional requirements. And clearly, MARAD is not ensuring that agencies are following the law. We need to change that and to guarantee that demand to guarantee demand for U.S. flag vessels. But there are two sides of the equation, I think. We've already heard some of the responses about what else we can do besides MARAD ensuring demand for U.S. And I want to ask Captain Marcus and Mr. Ebeling, can you weigh in also on additional measures that we should be considering to help ensure that U.S. flag vessels meet the demand for vessels and mariners? What else should we be doing?
Thank you, Congressman, for the inquiry. I think there's a lot that could be done. I think the starting point is clearly to have a national maritime policy. We lack a national maritime policy. We have a handful of programs to keep a minimal baseline of shipping afloat under U.S. flag, but we don't have a comprehensive national maritime policy. Specific things that could be done besides expanding the maritime security program or the tanker security program would be things like bilateral trade agreements, export quotas, which Congressman Garamendi and others have suggested over the years, and certainly a national program such as we saw in 1936. I mean, when there were war clouds in Europe in the 30s, U.S. Congress and President Roosevelt got together. They developed a merchant marine policy called the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. And what we have left is basically the remnants of those policies, a few new things added to keep us on a lifeline. But there's plenty of things that can be done. It requires national will, and it requires financial investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Marcus. Mr. Ebeling, anything that you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you, and certainly echo Captain Marcus's remarks there. I was reflecting on the chairman's remark earlier about the decline of the fleet from the 1990s through the present, and I think it's important maybe to take a step back and look at the goals for the U.S. flag fleet, and I think we've really emphasized the national security requirements. For example, Mr. Clark alluded to the mobility capability requirement study earlier. That has stayed pretty consistent at 19 to 20 million square feet of capacity needed to pursue the the national security objectives for sea lift, I think we need to expand the conversation beyond national security. Of course, defense sea lift should be prioritized, but we should be looking at other programs as well and maybe taking a little bit more of a holistic approach, looking at our global supply chains, looking at our contracting policies, looking at potential tax credits. So really kind of elevating the discussion a little bit. So thank you.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. I will recognize now Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes.
First, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding the hearing. It's very, very important. The maritime industry is exceedingly important. We do need what I would call a national maritime security policy that would go beyond the subject matter of this issue, this hearing, one that would provide using the Jones Act to meet the national military security. That's another hearing and another day. I believe that we need a new law. As I said previously to Admiral about her power, 4 administrators have failed to carry out the law. We need an explicit requirement that for each of you gentlemen, does it make sense that the administrator, MARAD administrator, have the authority and that the agencies must seek her permission or the administrator's permission to waive the requirement of current requirement of 50%?
In a word, yes. And I think that has been Congress's intent going back at least to the FY09 NDAA, but even further, probably back to the 1970 Act as well. So thank you.
Mr. Clark?
Yes, I agree.
Captain Marcos?
Absolutely. We need a new law. It needs to be effective. It needs to be implemented. Yes, sir.
Should we restore the 75% requirement?
Certainly speaking for labor, absolutely. It would bring more cargo. It would require more vessels and improve and increase the industry for the better of the nation. Thank you.
We would support that, but I would also argue perhaps to consider 100%, which would also take some of the gamesmanship out of it. Thank you.
Very good.
I agree, and I think 100% is the appropriate number because it does, open up a lot of interpretation otherwise. And I think it also requires stepping back and saying, what's the purpose of this program, which is fundamentally to ensure that we have a U.S. flagged fleet to support both our national security needs and insulate us against potential supply chain warfare. And we need to start thinking of it in this strategic approach as opposed to being just tactical.
And if there was a reasonable waiver associated with 100%, could we get past that argument that we would undoubtedly hear about 100%?
A waiver, but that would be something that MARAD should be agreeing to rather than something the agencies independently decide.
So a tight waiver, well-understood waiver.
Right.
Administered by MARAD.
Correct.
Yes.
Just to add, I think that's correct, but I would also argue that it should be subject to availability and fair and reasonable rates as well. And that's part of the existing law, and that I think even if it were 100%, that should probably stay part of the existing law. Thank you.
Captain Marcos, anything to add?
No, I would just echo what was said, but also say with the question of availability, which has been noted earlier in this hearing, the less cargo, the less ships are available. So as said earlier by Mr. Von Ah, if you're down to the last 3 bulk carriers in a U.S. flagged fleet, there's not going to be a whole lot of availability. So, you need a larger number of vessels to have the availability to use a program.
That goes to my next series of questions about waiving into the American flagged fleet ships that are presently not. Should we allow foreign flag ships to be reflagged into the American fleet? For example, the current 3-year law makes that almost impossible. Should we modify that in such a way as to allow those ships to be flagged in, to be more readily, to be available more quickly, and then requirements that they not be in and out? Does it make sense to do that?
Yes, certainly the 3-year wait has been noted earlier as a problem in the current law for flagging in vessels. And I do think there should be some mechanism to require the vessels, once flagged in, to remain in service for a defined period of time. But thank you, sir.
Mr. Eberling?
I would just add that removing the 3-year wait, while it may have some short-term positive impacts, would not necessarily generate any new cargo. And so I think that's an important consideration to bear in mind as well. Thank you.
Yes, and I agree, and I think the one thing to note is that it's, there are a set of requirements that you have to meet in order to be U.S. flagged that make it so that it's not just a jumping in and jumping out sort of operation. It'll take some time for a ship to be qualified and have the appropriate crew. So there is still a requirement in place, it's just not a time requirement.
My time having expired, but my question's not. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. That concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank the witnesses for your testimony. Your contributions to today's discussion has been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered, the subcommittee stands adjourned. I almost called Cheryl something else.
down to the street